Welcome to Licensed RPGs. Today we'll be taking a look at Naruto Uzumaki Chronicles, which was released for the PS2 back in November of 2006 for the US market. But before we move on to the plot and other important aspects of the game, I'd like to dedicate a little section to a few of my nitpicks with this title. I'll try to be quick in this section and discuss my biggest nitpick with this game first. The game is a total sausage fest, which is surprising for two reasons. One, every member of Team 7 besides Sakura is playable, and two, the game presents itself a situation to make Kanata playable by having her on a mission with Naruto, but does not take advantage of it. I question if some of this is because of an issue I'll bring up in the plot, but I think it's time I discuss my more minor nitpick with this title, which is the fact that it refers to your meter for special attacks as the stamina bar, while you collect chakra orbs from defeated enemies in order to refill it. I have no idea why they did that, but it annoys me just a smidge. But I guess it is time to move on to the plot. Story-wise, this game is a mess, and that is largely because of the fact that the game's original plotline was butchered in order to remove spoilers for the US market, which is why characters like Itachi, Yasame, and Tsunade were completely removed from the game in both FMVs and in-game cutscenes. This also means that the game is highly confusing if you attempt to place the fill arcs that they give us into the actual timeline. On one hand, we see that the game has to have taken place after the Chunin exam, since Neji admits to Naruto having beaten him previously. On the other hand, Kakashi refers to the current ruler of the Leaf as Lord Hokage, which rules out Tsunade since she isn't a man. But at the same time, the game had to have taken place after the invasion. Another issue is the fact that if you place it after the invasion but before Tsunade's reign, is that Naruto knows the Rasengan, even if this game changes its name to Power Strike in order to remove spoilers again. So what is the actual plotline of the game? You need to stop an army of the undead that are controlled by tiny spores that are dispersed within green mist and is being directed by Orochimaru. So basically it's the plot of The Happening, only slightly better. So this game may be better paced if only slightly, but I feel like it is time to move on to the gameplay itself. Gameplay-wise, Naruto Uzumaki Chronicles is more of a mindless beat-em-up than an RPG. In fact, this game can only be considered an RPG under the loosest of definitions, considering the only stats you can spend experience, or virtue as it's called in this game, are on health and stamina. Otherwise, you'll spend your virtue on skill chips that can increase your stats, grant you bonuses, or give you additional technique. But purchasing the skill chips doesn't mean that you're actually having any sort of impact on your character. If you wish to use a skill chip, you need to place it on a skill plate, and which skill plate you'll use will also become a factor later on in the game as you unlock additional skill plates to use, which have different spatial arrangements and thus make it easier to fit certain skill chips onto them. Though ultimately the biggest problem you'll face with the skill plates is determining which of your skill chips to use the limited room offered. Will you focus on stat boosting skill chips? Will you focus on skill chips that will draw in chakra and virtue orbs or increase the amount of orbs that are released when an enemy is defeated? Or will you focus on trying to place chips that will grant you additional moves like the Naruto Uzumaki Barrage or make them more powerful? And if those decisions aren't enough, you also have to consider the fact that you can only rotate the skill chips, which can make placing all the chips that you want difficult, if not impossible. Overall, I consider this a good system to bring to the table because it offers a more strategic element to a game that tends to be rather mindless when it comes to actual combat. On the combat side of things, the game is rather simplistic, with most of the characters being limited to 2 jutsus controlled by the R1, R2 button respectively, while Naruto manages to get 5 jutsus if you use certain techniques in combination with each other and equip certain skill chips. So outside the special attacks, you'll spend most of your time punching and kicking your enemies into submission, which is where you'll run into one of my biggest gripes with this game. A lot of the enemies in this game are capable of blocking your attacks, while your character is entirely reliant on dodging enemy strikes or a properly timed press of the X button in order to perform the substitution technique. Though correctly timing a substitution can be rather difficult because the camera is one of your biggest enemies in this game, it tends to be way too close to the action since you'll usually be attacked by mobs and enemies. It can be difficult to keep track of what's going on behind your character, considering it will probably be off screen. Though my biggest complaint isn't the rather mindless nature of the combat, or that it places a heavy emphasis on the use of special attacks like the Naruto Uzumaki Barrage in order to dispatch enemies effectively later on, but the sheer amount of escort and cargo transport missions there are. Between the main story missions, there are also missions that you have to take on for the village. On the plus side, you don't need to complete those missions successfully in order to advance the game. On the other hand, you'll probably want to beat those missions in order to acquire skill chips, skill plates, or healing items. Another frustrating factor with this game can be the jump mechanic. The jump can only be initiated from a standstill, and tends to feel rather awkward. On the plus side, you'll rarely need to jump in this game, but it does tend to come up in a few of the main story missions. And finally, before I forget, the shop operates in a rather weird fashion in this game. Instead of spending money to buy additional weapons, you exchange various items for other items. This barter system is nice and all, I guess, but can force the player to grind on weaker enemies in order to acquire weapons that are much easier to obtain in order to trade them for more powerful and difficult to find items. Though at this point I think it's time for me to move on to the mini-games that are included in this game. This game includes 3 mini-games, which are comprised of a game where you match button sequences on screen with Konohamaru, compete in a battle royale to see how many enemies you can defeat in 3 minutes under the watchful gaze of Jiraiya, and a dice game where the person with the highest number wins. While all 3 of these games are rather skippable in my opinion, they can be rather useful for dedicated players since they grant you special skill chips that can only be used a limited number of times before they disappear from your inventory. While these skill chips can only be used 5 times, they also grant very powerful and useful effects for boss battles. So at this point, it feels like it's time to try and quickly wrap things up by covering the graphics and sound departments for this title. Graphically speaking, the game seems alright for the most part, even if most of the enemies seem rather generic. The only downside to the graphics, in my opinion, comes in the form of Naruto's appearance in the CGI cutscenes, though this may be attributable to the art style rather than a lack of quality. On the other hand, I have little to say about the audio. All the background music felt rather appropriate, even if it wasn't particularly memorable, and while the voice acting may be a bit of a mixed bag, it doesn't feel out of place even if it isn't particularly impressive. Overall, the game is just rather average in both areas overall. Overall, I'd say give this game a pass. Though the game doesn't suffer from too many flaws mechanically, the overuse of escort and cargo missions kills any fun you can have with this title. And it doesn't help that sequel is a superior game that improves upon the mechanics that I enjoy and changes many of the mechanics that I found questionable, like how the shop operated.